What if the past has been trying to speak to us all along, and we simply lack the ears to hear it? Across deserts, islands, jungles, and ruins swallowed by time, messages were left behind. Not prophecies carved in fear, not myths meant to entertain, but records shaped by loss. Civilizations at the edge of collapse paused, looked forward into an unknown future, and tried to warn whoever might come next. They wrote in stone, etched symbols into wood, embedded memory into song, and trusted that someday someone would understand. For centuries, we mistook those messages for legends. We called them superstition, ritual, metaphor. We assumed ancient people lacked the tools to see the world clearly, that their explanations were poetic guesses rather than hard-earned insight. And so the warnings waited, silent, patient. Only recently did something change. Advances in linguistics, archaeology, climate science, and medicine began to unlock languages once thought unreadable. Oral traditions once dismissed as folklore were re-examined with new respect. Fragments ignored for generations were stitched together. And suddenly, a pattern emerged. Again and again, from cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the same realization surfaced. They knew. They knew what deforestation would do to rain and soil. They knew that healing substances could lose their power if abused. They recognized cycles of drought, flood, disease, and collapse. They understood that inequality hollows societies from within, that pride can be as deadly as hunger, that refusing to adapt is a slow form of surrender. Most unsettling of all, they knew these forces would return. The shock was not that ancient civilizations failed. Failure is human. The shock was that they understood why they were failing while it was happening, and that they tried deliberately to pass that understanding forward. Some carved their regret into stone when the last trees fell. Some described invisible enemies growing stronger with familiarity. Some sang of seas rising fast enough to drown a childhood home within a lifetime. Others analyzed the unraveling of empires with clarity that feels uncomfortably modern. And when we finally learned to read their words, something felt wrong. Because the disasters they described were no longer ancient history. They were headlines. They were data points. They were lived experiences unfolding in real time. Forests thinning, soils exhausting, medicines losing effectiveness, waters rising, populations moving, institutions fracturing under the weight of their own complexity. The warnings, once theoretical, now read like mirrors. This is not a story about blame, nor about inevitability. It is not a declaration that collapse cannot be avoided. It is something quieter, and perhaps more unsettling. It is the story of recognition arriving late, of knowledge surviving, but timing failing. Every civilization believes it stands at the pinnacle of understanding. Every era assumes it sees more clearly than the ones before it. And yet, over and over, the same mistakes reappear, dressed in new language, powered by new tools, justified by new confidence. The past does not shout, it whispers. It leaves fragments and trusts curiosity. It assumes humility. The question that opens this journey is not whether ancient people were wiser than we are. It is simpler and harder to answer. If we can finally understand the warnings left behind, are we willing to accept what they imply about us? Or are we destined to become another voice in the long human habit of speaking too late, hoping someone else will listen in time? It began in the rainforests of Mesoamerica, where stone cities now sleep beneath tangled green. For centuries, scholars speculated why the Maya, builders of towering temples and complex calendars, vanished from their great cities around 900 AD. Wars, famine, disease. Theories rose and fell like the very temples the Maya left behind. Then, in 2012, a translation changed everything. Archaeologists, working with newly deciphered inscriptions from the 9th century, found not just historical records, but something more chilling. A message directed at the future. A civilization on the brink, narrating its own undoing with devastating clarity. The Maya wrote about the trees. They spoke of forests, cleared to make way for farms, for roads, for monuments. They described how the soil, once rich, turned thin and brittle without roots to hold it, how rains grew erratic, how droughts deepened. They noted with precision how the more they tried to grow food, the more the land rebelled. Their words were not vague. When the soil dies, one inscription reads, "Your people will follow." They described collapsing water systems, failed harvests, cities too large to feed. But what made the records extraordinary were their deliberate warnings. These were not chronicles etched in grief after the fall. They were messages composed in the middle of crisis, directed at those who might come after. "We who built great cities have brought our own destruction," one scribe confessed. "The land has limits. Push beyond them, and the land will push back." For over a century, the ruins were silent. The meaning of these messages, hiding in plain sight, remained beyond our reach. And when we finally understood them, when the last glyphs were translated, our world was already echoing theirs. Deforestation accelerating across the Amazon, soil erosion worsening in farmlands from California to India, climate patterns shifting as trees vanish and rainfall grows erratic. The same feedback loops the Maya tried to describe, cycles of destruction that feed themselves, are now documented in climate models. Modern scientists reading the Maya inscriptions were stunned. The ancient texts articulated environmental feedback mechanisms modern science had only begun to model. The Maya didn't just observe symptoms, they understood processes, but understanding wasn't enough to save them. In the end, the Maya tried to adapt. They moved cities, built new reservoirs, changed rituals, but their solutions came too late. The tipping point had already been passed. The forests were gone. And what does it mean? That a civilization which knew it was collapsing chose to send warnings across time. It means they believed someone might listen, that the future might be wiser than the present. What if they were wrong? The Maya believed their knowledge mattered, even if they wouldn't live to see it help. They wrote not for glory, but for memory. And for all their brilliance, they couldn't stop the unraveling they themselves had triggered. We now hold their words in our hands, thousands of years later. We read them not as myth, but as science, not as prophecy, but as pattern. And still, the forests fall, the rain falters, the soil thins. The question remains, heavy as a stone temple. When a civilization knows it is collapsing, what does it choose to leave behind? And when we finally understand what they meant, will it matter if it's already too late? In ancient Mesopotamia, over 4,000 years ago, healers worked in temples, grinding herbs and molds into salves and tinctures. Their treatments came from observation, what healed, what didn't, and what grew in places where sickness receded. For generations, their knowledge was passed down on clay tablets, written in cuneiform, cataloging symptoms, remedies, and strange insights into the invisible forces that cause disease. To later eyes, the writing seemed like superstition. They spoke of invisible demons invading the body, of substances that healed until they stopped working. Then, in 2015, microbiologists with training in ancient languages re-examined these texts, and what they found was startling. The demons were bacteria. The treatments were natural antibiotics, molds, plant extracts, mineral compounds. And the warnings described something humanity was only beginning to grapple with: antibiotic resistance. One tablet, written nearly 40,600 years ago, offered a chilling insight. The healing substance from the blue mold must be used sparingly in cities where it is used freely. Wounds that would heal will fester unto death. The demon grows strong through knowledge of the substance. It was a precise description of how resistance evolves. Repeated use of the same medicine allows bacteria to adapt, to survive, to outsmart the remedy meant to destroy them. The Mesopotamians had no microscopes, no germ theory, no modern labs, but they had something else: patterns. They saw what happened when treatments were overused. They tracked where diseases lingered, where remedies failed, and they warned us, but we didn't understand. For decades, these tablets sat in museums and archives, dismissed as mystical ramblings. It wasn't until modern science caught up with ancient experience that we could decode the full meaning. But by then, we were already in trouble. The modern world has used antibiotics with astonishing success and equally astonishing carelessness. Overprescription, agricultural overuse, and incomplete treatments have created superbugs, bacteria that resist every known drug. The World Health Organization warns we may soon enter a post-antibiotic era, where common infections become deadly again. The Mesopotamians saw the seeds of this disaster before medicine had a name for it, and they tried to warn us. The tragedy lies in the timing. Their insight survived, but our understanding arrived too late. Only after resistance began to rise did we recognize the ancient pattern: how healing turns to harm when knowledge is used without wisdom. What if we had listened earlier? What if we had treated healing substances as precious, not infinite? What if every prescription had carried the weight of memory, that overuse today could mean uselessness tomorrow? The Mesopotamians faced the same dilemma: short-term healing versus long-term risk. They chose to caution, to urge restraint. We chose convenience. Now, as we search for new treatments, we look backward as much as forward. Ancient compounds, once dismissed, are being re-examined. The blue mold of old temples is studied again under electron microscopes. Forgotten remedies might save us yet, but the message remains clear. Knowledge is not immunity, and forgetting is fatal. They wrote on clay what they could not say aloud across centuries. This will happen again. Be wise with power. Spare the cure, or you will face the same invisible enemies, only stronger. We cracked the code, but not in time to prevent the crisis it foretold. What other wisdom, sleeping in old languages and overlooked texts, have we dismissed as myth while walking straight into the disaster they describe? Far across the Pacific, on islands scattered like stars in a deep blue sky, stories were sung long before they were written. Passed down through generations, these chants and tales told of gods, creation, and the ever-moving sea. For centuries, outsiders dismissed them as mythic poetry, beautiful but imaginary. Then, in 2008, linguists working with Pacific Island elders began to hear something different. Beneath the metaphor, they found measurement. Embedded in metaphors, they found memory. The stories weren't fables. They were records. They described islands that no longer exist. They told of seas rising suddenly, reclaiming land where ancestors once lived. When the great ice mountains in the far south begin to weep, one chant warned, the ocean will return to take what it gave. In Tuvalu, an oral tradition tells of islands that disappeared beneath water that rose as high as a man's chest within a single lifetime. That is no metaphor. Geological data confirms it. Around 8,000 years ago, sea levels surged by meters in mere decades, triggered by melting ice from the last great glacial retreat. And across Polynesia, stories match. The breakthrough came when scientists began comparing oral traditions to climate data and geological surveys. What seemed like myth turned out to be precise accounts of post-glacial sea rise. Across cultures separated by thousands of miles, people remembered the same event and passed down its signs. The warnings were specific. The sky will grow hot. The seasons will change. The storms will come more often. Then the sea will rise again. One Hawaiian chant translates, move to higher ground before the water claims you. These weren't just records of loss. They were instructions for survival. But they came to us late. By the time researchers recognized the meaning of the traditions in 2008, the signs had already returned. Sea levels were rising again. Storms were intensifying. Island nations were beginning to disappear. In Kiribati, seawater intrudes into fresh wells. In the Marshall Islands, homes vanish with the tide. Leaders negotiate land swaps with other countries, preparing to relocate entire nations. The prophecies, once dismissed as legend, are unfolding in real time. These cultures remembered. Their ancestors had lived through cataclysm. They had not only survived, but encoded the experience in language, song, and story, trusting that when the signs reappeared, their descendants would know what to do. And now, as coastlines vanish and weather turns wild, the world begins to understand what those songs were trying to say. The sea does not forget. It comes when it is called by melting ice and warming air. We had the stories, we had the signs, we had the data, but we did not listen. Not until it became our own homes, our own cities, our own shorelines under threat. These islanders were not predicting the future. They were remembering the past. And they were trying to warn us that memory is the key to survival. What knowledge have we failed to preserve because we refuse to take oral history seriously? How much wisdom has drowned beneath the rising sea of arrogance? The waves are coming. They always have. But the question remains, will we move to higher ground or wait until the water rises to our own chests? In a monastery library tucked away in the hills of Europe, a bundle of brittle documents sat unread for nearly a century. Written in a degraded Latin, mixed with Germanic fragments and obscure symbols, they were long dismissed as irrelevant, scribbles from Rome's fading twilight. But in 2017, new imaging techniques revealed what the naked eye could not. Beneath the smudges and faded ink, a voice emerged, clear, haunting, and uncannily familiar. It was the voice of Rome, watching itself fall. The anonymous chronicler described not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling. Crops failed. Rain came at the wrong times, or not at all. Winters grew longer, colder. Fields, once abundant, turned to dust and mud. And as food grew scarce, people grew weak. When the belly is empty, he wrote, the body surrenders to disease. Malnutrition weakened the immune system. Plagues followed. Bodies piled in cities already stretched thin. Rome, proud and vast, was starving from the inside out. The chronicler documented the signs, not just environmental, political, social. The Senate argues, while cities burn, he wrote bitterly. Each faction blames the others. None act together. Governors stopped waiting for Rome and took matters into their own hands. Borders blurred. Migrations surged. People fled droughts in the east, ice in the north, hunger everywhere. They come like water over a broken wall, he wrote. Not to conquer, but to survive. And perhaps most chilling of all were his final words. This pattern repeats. Those with eyes will see it in their own time. Watch for these signs: the shifting sky, the failing crops, the sickened poor, the moving masses, the splintering power. When they arrive together, know your time grows short. It wasn't just a chronicle, it was a manual, a pattern, a prophecy grounded in hard observation, not mysticism. And as historians read it in full for the first time in 2017, they recognized every part. Climate change disrupting agriculture, disease spreading rapidly through stressed populations, mass migration driven by environmental collapse, political paralysis in the face of crisis. The very architecture of modern civilization echoed with Rome's dying breath, and yet for centuries we had ignored the script. We'd studied Rome's fall in textbooks, debated barbarians and emperors, imagined flaming cities and sacked temples, but the truth was quieter, slower, more familiar. The fall didn't come from outside. It came from within, from a system too large, too rigid, too confident to adapt. Rome believed itself eternal. Every empire does. But the chronicler warned, eternity is built on soil, water, health, and trust. When those fail, so do you. We decoded his message while already living through its mirror. Too late to heed his warning in time, but maybe not too late to understand it fully. Because the pattern doesn't predict destiny. It predicts consequences. And consequences can still be changed, if seen, accepted, and acted on. We are not Rome, but we are not immune to what Rome endured. And the question left hanging in his final lines still applies. Will we recognize the signs for what they are, or only after the wall has already broken? Beneath the dry plains of South Asia lie the silent skeletons of one of humanity's earliest urban civilizations, the Indus Valley. For over a century, its script remained unreadable, its people mysterious. Their cities had no palaces, no great tombs, no clear conquerors. Just sudden abandonment. Then, in 2019, a breakthrough. Using AI to analyze symbols and linguistic links to early Dravidian languages, researchers finally cracked fragments of Indus script etched on pottery shards, seals, and stone. What emerged was not myth, but diagnosis, a civilization slowly poisoned by its own progress. The Indus people had mastered irrigation, turning arid lands into fertile fields. Their cities thrived on water, carried from rivers through sophisticated channels. But in the texts, a warning appears again and again. The White Death creeps through the soil. At first, it was a curiosity, salt, crusting the earth after dry seasons. But year after year, as water evaporated, salts stayed behind. The more they irrigated, the more the salts accumulated. The crops began to fail. One inscription reads, "The water that feeds also poisons. Each season, the fields bear less. The land withers, though the rivers still run." This wasn't an accident. It was a cycle they understood, but couldn't escape. They wrote it plainly. We must leave these lands. The soil remembers what we pour into it. The final inscriptions offer stark advice. Those who farm the dry lands, beware the water you bring. It carries death you cannot see. Spare the land, or the land will forsake you. By the time we deciphered these messages, the tragedy had already returned on a global scale. Today, nearly 20% of the world's irrigated farmland suffers from salinization. In California's Central Valley, in China's northern plains, in Australia's river basins, farmers fight the same enemy the Indus people faced. Invisible salts slowly choking the life from the soil. Modern satellites map it. Agronomists warn about it. But the Indus farmers knew it without instruments. They watched it in the fields, in the stunted crops, in the crusted earth. And they tried to tell us, but their words were lost to time, misunderstood, misfiled, ignored, until it was already happening again. Their cities weren't burned, they weren't conquered. They were abandoned, one by one, as the white crust spread. People scattered, searching for land that hadn't yet been ruined. They left behind no monuments of conquest, no tales of glory, just practical knowledge written in a language no one could read about how progress, unchecked, becomes its own undoing. Their irrigation fed millions, until it didn't. And now we do the same, on a far vaster scale. Deserts bloom briefly, only to harden again. We farm as if the soil is infinite. We irrigate as if water carries no memory. The Indus Valley tried to warn us, and we understood just in time to see the same mistake repeated. They left a message in the soil, in the salt, in the silence of cities emptied by their own ambition. Now the question turns to us. Can we farm wisely where they farmed too much? Can we listen to what the poisoned ground remembers? Or will we write our warnings into a future that cannot read them until it is already too late? In the icy reaches of medieval Greenland, Norse settlers once carved out a fragile existence. They built farms, raised cattle, and clung to the familiar rhythms of their Scandinavian homelands. For centuries they endured. Then, quietly, they vanished. For generations, no one knew why. It wasn't war, no signs of invasion, no mass graves, just the eerie abandonment of homesteads, churches, and burial grounds left to freeze beneath the snow. In 2011, everything changed. Researchers deciphered a series of fragmentary manuscripts, ink faded, languages mixed, pages broken by time. They came from Greenland's North settlement, dated to the late 1300s. What they revealed was not just a record of hardship, but a reckoning with identity, pride, and the refusal to adapt. The Norse, it turned out, were watching themselves die, and they knew why. The Skraelings live, one entry reads, using the Norse term for the Inuit. They wear the furs of beasts, hunt the seal, move with the ice and the sun. They thrive where we starve. The Inuit, native to the Arctic, had adapted perfectly to the changing climate. They used kayaks, hunted marine life, built portable shelters, wore sealskin against the cold. The Norse knew this. They saw it work, but they could not bring themselves to follow. We are Christians. We are Norwegians. We do not live as they do, one scribe wrote, even as cattle died and children succumbed to hunger. One haunting passage, written with quiet finality, reads, "The farms are empty. The ship has not come. The elders say we must keep our ways, and so we do, and so we die." The tragedy wasn't just environmental, it was cultural. The Little Ice Age had begun, cooling Greenland's climate, shortening growing seasons, icing over trade routes. But survival was still possible. The Inuit proved it. What the Norse lacked wasn't knowledge, but flexibility. Pride killed them. The final entries are heavy with resignation. Some said we should learn from the Skraelings, but the elders refused. We must not become savages, they said, and so the church stands alone. its doors open to no one. They didn't perish in a storm or a raid. They faded out, steadfast in tradition, rigid in identity. They chose death over change. When researchers translated the manuscripts in full, they saw the echoes instantly. Climate change again altering environments, again requiring adaptation, again resisted by institutions bound to old ways. The Greenland Norse saw the solution in front of them and turned away. They left us their final confession. Survival requires change. The world shifts, and those who cannot shift with it are buried beneath it. Today, we face a shifting world. Weather patterns breaking, oceans rising, harvests strained. The Inuit still adapt, living traditions molded to changing landscapes. But the modern world, vast and interconnected, struggles to bend. We hold fast to systems that no longer serve us. Economic models built on infinite growth. Cities built for climates that no longer exist. Industries bound to fuels that heat the air around us. Like the Norse, we know the changes are here. Like them, we see what works, and often reject it. The manuscripts from Greenland don't just warn. They ask, what are we willing to give up to survive? And if we're not willing to change, are we prepared to write our own final entry? Not in the snow, but in the silence that comes when pride speaks louder than reason, and the last fires go cold. On a remote island in the Pacific, where winds scrape bare earth and the ocean hammers jagged cliffs, hundreds of stone faces gaze inland. Towering, solemn, their features frozen in time. These are the Moai of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, monuments to a vanished people and a warning written in silence. For decades, the island was seen as a cautionary tale. Forests turned to grassland. A population that once flourished dwindled to a fraction, but no one knew the full story. The island's written language, Rongo Rongo, was undeciphered, its tablets reduced to mystery. Until 2013, researchers using computational linguistics cracked key portions of the Rongorongo script. What they found wasn't mythology or genealogy, it was testimony. One line translated, "We cut the last trees, knowing they were the last." That sentence changed everything. It revealed that the people of Rapa Nui didn't collapse in ignorance. They knew what they were doing. They documented it. Another passage reads, "We chose the statues over the forest. We valued our glory over our survival." Easter Island had once been lush, covered in palm forests. The trees were used to move the great Moai, to build boats, to cook food. As the forests thinned, the islanders faced a choice: stop or continue until nothing was left. They chose to continue. Rongorongo tablets describe elders warning that the final trees must be preserved. But the chiefs demanded one more statue, always one more. "We said, the trees can wait," one tablet records. "Always the trees can wait." But the trees ran out. And when they were gone, the birds left. The soil washed away. Crops failed. Boats could no longer be built. The people turned on one another. The glory of the Moai remained, towering but useless as the society that built them unraveled. The most poignant line in the translated text reads, "We were fools. Let those who read this be wiser." The parallels are stark. Today, global deforestation continues at alarming rates. Rainforests fall to agriculture. Old-growth wood becomes luxury flooring. The biodiversity of entire ecosystems vanishes beneath the blade. And still we say, one more, just one more. We build monuments, not of stone, but of glass and steel. Cities that glow while the forests dim. Growth measured in numbers, not in roots. or nests or soil. The people of Rapa Nui didn't lack knowledge. They lacked the will to stop. They watched their world diminish year by year, and each time they justified the next cut, the next statue, the next sacrifice, until there was nothing left to sacrifice but themselves. And yet, they tried to warn us. Their last messages weren't desperate pleas. They were confessions, meant for someone who might one day understand. Now we do. And the question that looms, heavy as a stone moai, is not whether we will repeat their mistake. We already are. The real question is whether we will stop in time, whether we'll value survival over monuments, forests over pride, whether we'll hear the voices in the stone whispering across centuries. This is what it looks like when you choose glory over life. They spoke their truth before the silence came. Are we listening or simply waiting for our own trees to fall? In the heart of North America, near present-day St. Louis, a city once rose from the earth. Tall mounds, wide plazas, timber palisades stretching toward the sky. It was called Cahokia, and at its height, around 1250 AD, it was one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London at the time. Then, barely a century later, it was empty. For years, archaeologists puzzled over its fall. No signs of conquest, no great fire, no epidemic graves, just a city slowly abandoned. Then, in 2016, researchers deciphered a set of pictographs found carved into wooden posts buried in elite mounds, symbols that had long been dismissed as ceremonial or decorative. What they found was a diagnosis of collapse, not from enemies or disease, but from within. The pictographs told a story of division. Early carvings depicted shared food stores, balanced exchanges, symbols of equality. But as time progressed, the imagery changed. Elites amassed wealth. Symbols of grain hoarded in vast silos, goods pouring in from trade routes. Meanwhile, depictions of the common people became smaller, stripped of adornment, their symbols for food reduced or absent. The final carvings were unmistakable. They take and do not return, one reads. The chiefs eat while the people hunger. The workers refuse the fields. Another, the warriors cannot hold order. Too many are angry. The city breaks. And then, a final warning carved into the wood. A city divided cannot stand. When the few have everything and the many have nothing, the people will leave, not with weapons, but with silence. And that's exactly what happened. There was no war, no fire. People simply walked away. Excavations show common dwellings abandoned mid-use, possessions left behind. The elites remained briefly, then faded, as their power evaporated without people to govern. Cahokia's collapse was not a moment. It was a slow exhale, and the cause was not mysterious. It was inequality. The message left behind was unambiguous. We built greatness through cooperation. We destroyed it through greed. Today, wealth inequality in the modern world has reached levels not seen since feudal times. A small fraction controls vast resources. Housing, healthcare, education, once shared pillars, fracture under privatization. Social trust erodes. Institutions polarize. Many, like the people of Cahokia, quietly opt out, leaving cities, withdrawing from systems they no longer believe serve them. Cahokia teaches us something vital. Collapse doesn't always come with fire and screams. Sometimes it comes with stillness, a refusal, a slow, collective decision to stop playing a rigged game. The people left, and the city, once a marvel of cooperation and planning, became mounds and memories. They didn't just vanish, they made a choice. Cahokia was not the first society to fall to inequality. It won't be the last. But it may be one of the few that left behind a clear message in its ruins. Power without justice is a hollow monument, and those who hoard the harvest will one day find the fields empty, not from revolt, but from absence. We decoded their warning centuries later as inequality grows again. The timing, as always, is precarious, and the question rises again from the soil. When will we recognize that survival is not built on division, but on balance? And how many cities must empty before we understand? Carved into canyon walls and painted on stone, the ancestral voices of the ancestral Puebloans, sometimes called the Anasazi, echo across the American Southwest. Their cliff dwellings and great pueblos once pulsed with life, astronomy, art, and ceremony. Then, around 1300 AD, they too vanished from their grand settlements. The canyons fell silent. For decades, researchers knew that a prolonged drought struck the region during this time, but it wasn't clear why a people who had survived so many hardships before could not endure this one. Then, in 2018, something clicked. Petroglyphs and kiva murals, long interpreted as symbolic or spiritual, were reanalyzed with the help of indigenous scholars, archaeologists, and atmospheric scientists. A new layer of meaning emerged. They weren't just sacred stories. They were warnings. The early images depicted recognizable signs of drought, rivers thinning, clouds receding, certain animals vanishing. These weren't metaphors. They were field guides, indicators to watch. Our fathers' fathers left us these marks, one mural reads, when translated through Puebloan symbolic systems. When the deer go, when the springs dry, when the clouds forget the mountain, know the dry time is near. In the middle layers of art, debates are etched into stone. Some figures gesture to pathways leading away from settlements, others to ceremonial circles, lifting their hands to the sky. The elders knew the old stories. They remembered past droughts. The ancestors had survived them by moving, breaking into smaller bands, returning to a mobile, resilient life. But not this time. This time, leaders insisted on staying. They believed their rituals could summon rain, that their gods would not abandon their great houses, that their civilization, now so advanced, so spiritual, need not retreat to the old ways. And so, they waited, they prayed, they built, and the sky remained dry. The final petroglyphs are stark: dying corn, emaciated figures, empty homes, trails leading away from the canyons. One late image shows a lone figure looking back at a cliff dwelling, a hand raised, not in farewell, but in mourning. We saw the signs, a translated glyph reads, but we believed ourselves stronger than the sky. We were wrong. The ancestral Puebloans had inherited wisdom from those who survived before. They carved it in stone, and when the time came to act, they ignored it. The pattern is achingly familiar. Today, we too face droughts intensified by climate change, rivers drying, forests thinning, animals vanishing from warming ranges. We too have ancient knowledge, scientific now, not spiritual, warning us what comes next. And still, we argue. Still, we cling to permanence. Still, we resist the mobility, flexibility, and humility survival requires. The kivas lie empty now. The murals remain. Their colors faded, but their message clearer than ever. Those who ignore the warnings of their ancestors will learn the same lessons again, through suffering. The sky does not bend to belief. It listens only to balance, to restraint, to cycles honored. The ancestral Puebloans didn't lack knowledge. They lacked permission to change, to leave, to let go of what had once worked but no longer could. And that is the question we must ask ourselves now. Do we have the wisdom to act on the warnings already carved into the world? Or will we too stay too long, believing ourselves stronger than the storm? In 2020, amid the dust and debris of Alexandria's ruins, a fragment surfaced, barely preserved in a waterproof container hidden under layers of silt. It wasn't a scroll of philosophy or myth. It was a catalogue, a ledger, a record of what the Great Library once held. What startled researchers was not just the list of lost knowledge, but the summaries. Among them were references to far older texts, copies from Egypt, Babylon, and beyond. Many were warnings, precise, methodical, and disturbingly familiar. One entry spoke of the Great Burning from the archives of the Old Kingdom, when the mountains smoke and the sky rains ash, when the sun is hidden and the cold follows. Seek high ground. The signs are tremors, fleeing beasts, and fire from the earth. This was not myth. It was a memory of volcanic winter. Modern science confirms that massive volcanic eruptions can darken skies and cool the planet. The Toba eruption nearly wiped out humanity 74,000 years ago. Others have caused famines, extinctions. The catalogue's words matched the geological record with eerie accuracy. Another entry referenced the Great Wave from Babylonian texts. When the ocean retreats and the ground trembles, flee to the hills. The sea will come roaring back. This was a description of a tsunami, a precise sequence of observable warnings identical to modern tsunami protocols. Across dozens of entries, the catalogue listed observations of cycles, droughts, floods, diseases, sky-darkening plagues, and each entry ended not with fear, but instruction. They weren't myths. They were survival guides. And at the very end of the catalogue, in fading ink, came the scribe's voice. We gather the wisdom of the ages so that when catastrophe comes again, humanity will not forget. These cycles are older than kings, stronger than empires. Let the library preserve the signs so future peoples may endure. But the library burned. Fire after fire, war after war. The knowledge meant to outlast time was consumed by it. What could have warned generations became smoke. What could have saved cities became myth. We recovered the catalogue too late. Tsunamis still catch unprepared towns. Volcanoes still bury unknowing villages. Droughts and floods swing in cycles we continue to misread, even as ancient texts had charted them millennia ago. We live surrounded by the remnants of civilizations that understood more than we give them credit for. They mapped danger in metaphor, in rhythm, in observation repeated across centuries. But their wisdom was fragile. It relied on memory. And memory, too often, burns. The tragedy is not only in the loss, it's in how close we came to keeping it. The Library of Alexandria was built to prevent forgetting. It almost worked. Almost. Now, with tools unimaginable to those ancient librarians, satellites, sensors, AI, we rediscover what they already knew. We translate what they tried to tell us. And still, the sea rises, the mountains smoke, the warnings go unheeded until after the fact. The catalogue's last line reads like a lament. These records are not for glory. They are for survival. Forget them, and the forgetting will consume you. They knew knowledge is not just power, it is refuge. And now that we have the fragments, the question remains, will we finally rebuild what they tried to preserve? Or will our libraries, too, be remembered only by what was lost? There is something haunting in the realization that so many of history's loudest warnings came not in shouts, but in whispers, not in battles, but in patterns. And in the case of these 10 ancient messages, in languages we only recently learned to hear. Across time and geography, from jungles to deserts, from icy shores to island coasts, each warning tells a variation of the same story. Knowledge born from suffering, preserved in hope, and understood too late. The Maya carved their collapse into stone. The forests fall, the rains vanish, and the soil turns to dust. We, who built great cities, have destroyed them, they said. The Mesopotamians etched medical wisdom into clay. Healing substances lose power when overused. The demon grows strong through knowledge of the cure. Pacific Islanders sang of seas that swallowed the land. When the sky grows hot and the storms come more often, know the ocean is rising. Rome wrote of empires falling not by sword, but by silence, sickness, and disunity. The pattern repeats, the chronicler warned. The Indus Valley recorded the creeping poison of salt in soil. The water feeds, then kills. Use it wisely, or the land will abandon you. The Norse of Greenland confessed their pride. We die because we would not learn from those who survived. The people of Rapa Nui left confessions in their stone tablets. We cut the last trees, knowing they were the last. We chose glory over survival. Cahokia's pictographs told of inequality splitting the center of the city. A city divided will empty itself. The ancestral Puebloans drew the drought in stone and asked, why did we ignore the signs our ancestors left for us? And from the ashes of Alexandria, a librarian's voice cried out, we gather wisdom to survive cycles. Forget, and the forgetting will destroy you. Each message, distinct in form, yet unified in spirit, presents the same plea. Look, listen, remember. But in every case, we only understood the warnings when it was already too late. The forests had fallen. The soil had died. The seas were already rising. The superbugs had already spread. The inequality had already hollowed. The sky had already turned dry. The timing was off by just enough to matter. These were not obscure prophecies buried in secret vaults. They were visible, public, encoded in stone, clay, song, symbol. Some sat in museum drawers. Others were dismissed as folklore. Some were simply lost in translation. The knowledge was there. We just couldn't or wouldn't hear it. What makes these stories tragic is not just that disasters happened. Disasters happen. It's that the knowledge to avoid them was passed down, and we failed to catch it in time. But perhaps there's still something to learn in that failure. Perhaps the lesson is not only in the specifics, soil salinity, rising seas, antibiotic decay, but in the pattern itself. That knowledge fades when it's not respected. That warnings must be heard before the crisis, not after. That the wisdom of past civilizations deserves more than curiosity. It deserves application. The past does not repeat, but it rhymes, and the stanzas of collapse echo louder now than ever. We live in a moment where ancient mistakes align with modern dilemmas. Climate, health, division, pride. And the decisions we make now will become either our warnings or our legacy. 10 warnings, 10 missed chances. But maybe, just maybe, we still have one left to hear, the one we write ourselves. Picture the archaeologist of tomorrow, sifting through the ruins of our age, a cracked tablet here, a melted phone screen there, fragments of servers and satellites and concrete jungles swallowed by vines. What will they find? A message or a silence like the ones we uncovered. The ancient warnings we've now decoded were not subtle. They were painstakingly recorded, repeated, and embedded in everything from architecture to language to ritual. They weren't prophecies, they were instructions. Not cries of doom, but survival strategies earned through pain. What makes them devastating is how clearly they speak to us now. The Maya described environmental collapse down to the feedback loops we only recently quantified. The Mesopotamians observed antibiotic resistance millennia before penicillin. The Pacific Islanders remembered sea level rise with centimeter-level accuracy. The Roman chronicler outlined a pattern of societal breakdown that reads like today's news. The Indus farmers warned of salinization that now threatens global food security. The Norse chronicled cultural rigidity as lethal. The Rapa Nui carved ecological regret into wood. Cahokia's pictographs described economic collapse through social fracture. The ancestral Puebloans warned about ignoring ancestral climate wisdom. And Alexandria's catalogue was a final desperate plea: preserve the cycle or perish in the forgetting. These weren't lost until we needed them. They were unread until it was too late. Which leads to the most unsettling question of all. What warnings are we leaving now? Because we are documenting obsessively. We leave behind billions of pages, millions of hours of video, endless streams of data, carbon records, atmospheric readings, extinction logs, income graphs, emergency reports. Our signals are louder than any civilization before us. But clarity is not just about data, it's about will. Will the future recognize what we meant? Will they hear urgency or confusion? Will they find a culture that saw the cliff and jumped, or one that learned, finally, how to step back? The ancient voices we've finally understood all echo with one final emotion. Not fear, not anger, grief. They knew, they tried, and they failed to reach us in time. We now stand at the inflection point. Not at the end, not yet, but close enough to feel the weight of our decisions. We can no longer claim we didn't know. The patterns are known. The questions now are not about awareness, but about response. Not about memory, but about meaning. What we choose to do in this moment becomes the message, becomes the warning, becomes the legacy. The future will read us as we read the past. And the inscriptions are already forming. In the climate, the economy, the soil, the silence, the noise. They will ask, one day, just as we asked of the Maya, the Norse, the Romans, the forgotten scribes of forgotten cities. Did they understand? Did they try? And did they act before the last tree fell? The last voice faded? The last chance passed? That question is not for the past. It is for us, right now. The echoes have reached us, from stone and song, from clay and salt, from ruined temples and forgotten libraries. They arrived, late, but not too late to be heard. Each civilization we explored carried the same burden. They witnessed the unraveling of their world, and in its final moments, they turned not only to survival, but to memory. They carved what they knew into permanence, not to glorify themselves, but to warn us. We now stand in the rarest of places, the moment after understanding, but before decision. The crossroads where comprehension meets consequence. For perhaps the first time in history, we can see the full pattern, stretching across thousands of years. Collapse is not a thunderclap. It is an accumulation of heat, of imbalance, of pride, of delay. But if collapse can be accumulated, then perhaps wisdom can be as well. We have more tools than the Maya, more medicine than Mesopotamia, more knowledge than Alexandria. But do we have more humility? That, more than technology or intelligence, may determine our future, because every warning we decoded had one thing in common. They were too late. The knowledge was right, but the timing failed. Wisdom delayed is tragedy repeated. And so, our task becomes something greater than avoidance. It becomes transformation. Can we act on what we now know, not just in data, but in meaning? Can we let ancient grief guide modern courage? Can we choose to become ancestors worth remembering? The past speaks not in curses, but in counsel. Adapt, the Norse said, or perish in pride. Share, Cahokia whispered, or watch your greatness hollow out. Respect the land, said the Maya and the Indus and the Rapa Nui, for it does not forget. Remember, said the Library of Alexandria, for forgetting is a slow death. And from every voice, every ruin, every whisper carved in fading lines, listen, listen now. We will not be the last civilization. Someday, someone will study the footprints we leave behind. They will ask what we knew. They will ask what we did. Let them find more than warnings. Let them find a turning. Let them find a moment when memory was finally enough, not to mourn the past, but to change the future. The pattern does not have to end in silence. It can end in understanding and begin again in wisdom.